Carbide wood turning tools are great additions to wood turning. They stay sharp for a long time, they're easy to learn, easy to use, etc. And just as traditional turning tools, the carbide inserts can be sharpened. One of the most common ways that you've probably already seen is by laying the carbide cutters topside down on a diamond stone or a CBN stone, and with light pressure and a circular motion, one can extend the life of the cutter and have a really nice, sharp, decent cutter again. And I've been sharpening my carbide cutter inserts this way for a couple years now, and I use either my bench stone or credit card files with some lubricant, as in some lapping fluid or some Windex. But today I'm going to try a different method because, as you can see here, most of my carbide cutters are in need of a serious overhaul. And with this method, I should be able to sharpen any of my cutters, no matter what the shape, including a cup carbide, which is always difficult to sharpen. The other day while I was looking at my buffing wheels, I remembered a video a few years back from Ken from Wood Turn Wonders, and he sharpened some carbide on a lathe. So I thought if I could find a small enough buffing wheel mandrel, I can sharpen my carbide cutters. Well, lo and behold, a rotary tool has a small mandrel that is used for cutoff wheels, and it actually fits really well with my small carbide cutters. And I know they make these mandrels in 1/8 and 1/4 sizes, and they're fairly cheap. However, I haven't been able to find the right size mandrel for my larger carbide cutters. I know they make them, I just don't have it in my shop, so I'm going to make one. So the only thing I have to concern myself with is finding the right screw or the right bolt that'll sit or recess its head below the cutter surface. Like this screw here is too big. It's protruding. But I also wanted to think about the different size cutters. And I know brands vary in the sizes and the holes and the thicknesses of each of the carbide cutters. But that's easy enough to overcome. I just need a screw or a mandrel or a bolt that will fit either the small or large carbides. Now the screws would be for wooden mandrels. I just took a wooden dowel and shaped it up so it was completely 90 degrees on the surface, on the end. Or you can use metal, as in this aluminum rod. I'm not sure what type of aluminum it is. I just bought it at the home store. And just a tip, if you are going to use aluminum or wood, give yourself a little extra room in case one of the screws break off or your holes strip out from the tapping or the tap breaks off in there. At least you'll have some room to start again. Not that I speak from experience. So after you pick out your bolts, or you could also use the bolts that already hold the cutters on your tools, then you can just head over to the lathe and make sure that your lathe is running true, or else you'll be wondering why you can't true up your mandrel. Kind of goes without saying, but I figured I'd mention it anyway. So whatever you decide to use to true up your mandrel, just don't use something that's flexible or spongy. You want something that's hard and flat. You can either use sandpaper on a wooden block, or even your carbide cutters would work on the soft aluminum, or even some metal files would work. No matter what you choose to use, please be safe. And if you don't feel comfortable with anything, don't do it. Safety first. Well, it came out nice and polished. I went from 120 to 7,000 grit. Then I found the centers on each end, and now I'm going to use a tap and the corresponding drill bit for the bolts that I chose, which in my case ended up being a 440 tap with a number 43 drill bit for my small carbide cutters and my cup cutter, and then for my large cutters it was an 832 tap with a number 29 drill bit, which actually ended up being the same size as my large carbide cutter on the tool. Also, if you had a metal lathe, making one of these would probably be much simpler. Or simpler yet, you can just throw out all of your carbide tips when they get dull and buy new ones. Of course, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of this video. Well, I'm going to start off sharpening my round carbide cutter, and I'm going to use diamond cards. You can use CBN cards, those would work as well. Just don't use whetstones for safety reasons. They could possibly blow up in your hand. So the first diamond card that I'm going to use is a coarse grit. It's 325 mesh or a 45 micron, and it is the DMT brand. And yes, I know I did put on a glove, and in general I would say don't wear a glove or loose clothing near the lathe, but with the spinning carbide, I can possibly slip and cut my fingers really bad, so I'm just keeping my fingers well away from the lathe. And I'm starting out at a low speed of 500 because that's the lowest my lathe goes. Then I switch over to my next grit, which is the fine, and that's a 600 mesh with a 25 micron. Same brand, DMT. Then my last grit, which is the extra fine, and that's a 1200 mesh with a 9 micron. Again, same brand, DMT. And I'm doing a light pressure or the circular motion. And it came out great. If they cut as good as they look, I'll be pretty happy. It's actually pretty fun to sharpen your carbides this way. And if you have numbers on the carbides and they're removed, you can just use a Sharpie to indicate one side so you'll know if you turn it later, you know which side you've used. I personally only turn them once because I use the sides and the front all the time. Next, I'm moving on to my smaller carbide cutters with a smaller hole. So I'm going to use my rotary tool mandrel. And if you are going to use this in a Jacob's chuck on your lathe and that headstock, make sure that you use a drawbar for safety. Next, I'll show you how I'm going to sharpen the cup carbide cutter, which I'm going to put on the same rotary tool mandrel. Basically, I just take my diamond cards and I'll follow the angle that's already on the carbide cutter and try to keep it really flat and try to not round over the edges at all. I'm sharpening the side of this cup cutter only, not the top. So I really hope you enjoyed this first video in a series of sharpening videos to come. Sharpening my carbide cutters this way as opposed to sharpening them on a flat stone when they're really boogered up was definitely an improvement. Again, if you don't feel safe in using these on your lathe with the spinning carbide bits, please don't do it. You can just use these if you wanted to as holders and put it in there, and it makes it easier to grip the carbide if you're sanding it by hand. Also, if you do have CBN wheels with grit down the side, you can sharpen them that way, and these would be good for little holders. The smaller mandrel worked really well for my littler carbide cutters. I also found a couple more in the shop and these are a little bit bigger. There's a 1/4 and a 1/8 and a 1/4. This one would probably work for my larger carbide cutters, but right now this screw is too big, so I'd have to find a different screw that would fit in here with the same threads. There's lots of options you could do, whatever is easiest, and depends on your turning and your turning style. I don't think I mentioned that you don't need to sharpen them for very long. If you do sharpen them for like over a minute or something like that, you may wear down the carbide cutter. Another thing I'd like to mention with the carbide cutters, it's always a good idea to have two sets, kind of like lawnmower blades, where you have a set on the tool, and when they get dull, you can immediately switch it out with another one that's already sharp, and you don't have to waste time sharpening it. And then some other time when you have the free time or in between a project, you could sharpen the dull one, and then you always have another sharp carbide cutter ready to go. So as always, please stay safe in your shop at all times. If you have not subscribed, please feel free to do so. I'd also like to thank all of my subscribers and my new subscribers and the people that continue to buy or purchase items that I use here in the shop on my Amazon channel. I really appreciate that. So until next time, take care and thank you.